Alright, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how to export, import, and how you would edit a model to use in the Visual Effects Editor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this scythe, which is Ferdiad's scythe, or Ferdiad Hollows scythe from Dunscape, I believe. I'm going to export it from Textools, import it into Blender, show you how to save it from Blender, and then how to load it into the Visual Effects Editor. Alright, so let's begin by exporting this weapon by FBX. And give this a moment. Alright, so that's exported. Now I'm going to import FBX. Textools, saved. And it's under, where did it go? Whoops. Main hand. Alright, so here's my weapon. Now what I want to do is I want to make sure this is all one single mesh. So I'm going to select all the model pieces and I'm going to join them. The reason I do this is because the Visual Effects Editor will recognize only a single mesh, or at least it seems to only recognize a single mesh, and the textures that actually go on the particle, which is what this is going to become, will only act as on one mesh. That's as far as I've been able to mess around with. So I'm going to export this, and I want to export this as GLTF. I'm going to put it in the area that I usually export to, which is here. And I've already made one just as practice, but I'm going to replace it. You want to replace it, or you want to use GLTF embedded.gltf in Blender. Then come down to geometry, this drop down, and check tangents. You want that checked off. So now I'm going to export it. And I'll go and come into the game here. Now I've already pulled up the visual effect file that I originally used, which is this thing. And it kind of worked. It's kind of funny. It's actually a pickaxe. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the models that I originally used. And I'm going to just replace, select Ferdiad's hat. So that's, again, that's replace. Select your scythe or your weapon. You do that for all the weapon models that you want to replace. Now this is much bigger, so I'm going to go ahead and scale it back down to its normal size because the pickaxe was scaled up really large. And now I'm going to spawn it. See? Alright, all black. Let's go ahead and summon the bomb. Now I'm gonna go ahead and start recoloring it. So when I first made this, you can use 2 in the emitter field under influence color for parent influence color, and that'll allow emitters to influence the color of particles quite a bit. But I do know also all of these particles also have colors on them that are going to affect the color of the scythe. So I want to go ahead and change those back to how they kind of were when I first made this weapon. So I'm going to change all the particles. I don't want them too bright. White, whenever you're doing or messing with particles, model particles, and you see the color begin, color end, white will essentially give you an unaffected color. It shouldn't affect the color of that particle. It'll just leave it as the color of whatever this is, or whatever the texture colors make it. So I'm going to set those all to white so that they don't affect anything. Black usually makes it, will either make it invisible, or depending on the different settings with the particles, or it'll make it solid, opaque black like it did with the scythe with this model. Whoops, wrong thing. Alright, so here's the scythe again. Kind of interesting textures. You'd have to fiddle around with the textures and everything. I still haven't figured out a way how to import the actual textures for the weapon into the game, but let's see this now on the original Ferdiad that I made. So yeah, there's that. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this off, update it. I'll show you the first Ferdiad I made now, and then the changes. So yeah, there was the first Ferdiad I made. Give it a few moments for Bahamut to come up. But yeah, pretty much you will export from Textools into Blender. You're gonna, since you have to export as one of the options, usually FBX from Blender, and Visual Effects Editor won't recognize FBX. So once you export into Blender, change it to GLTF, save it properly with the tangents checked, and then import it into the Visual Effects Editor. So now the change. Yeah, I'll eventually redo Ferdiad 2 with hex code updates, but let's show how to export and what it looks like when you export a weapon model. So I'm just going to export the same weapon I imported. I'll export as GLTF, and I'm going to go ahead and save over the one that I already made. Now go back into Blender, and let's do a new one. Don't save. Now I'm going to import GLTF. So when you export a visual effect from the Visual Effects Editor, you'll export it as GLTF because that's kind of what Blender will recognize. So I'm going to import it. And there it is. Alright, so as you can see, the weapon looks a bit different now than it did when I originally exported it from Blender. For one, all of the entire model is one single piece, just like I left it, but there's no bones now in it. So Visual Effects Editor will remove the bones from a model. But yeah, that's pretty much from here. You could edit the weapon however you want, and then save it the same way as you saved the original one. That's pretty much how you can import, export, and edit weapon models, or various models, from the game or from Textools, from the Visual Effects Editor, to use them as visual effects. It's very useful for like making weapons for creatures that don't already have weapons. Like Ferdiad did not originally have a weapon with his model, so I had to add one. I haven't figured out how to add weapons to the models themselves so that I wouldn't have to go through this process, but this is a pretty decent process for doing weapon visual effects for creatures, for editing weapon models or visual effects models for for weapons that have visual effects already, um, or like putting a creature's model into the game as a visual effect, like I did with the Magus sisters. Pretty much, uh, a lot of stuff you can do with editing models for visual effects. But yeah, that's everything.